hate to admit it, but I kind of like this chick flick. Guys, I'm sorry. It's like crossing over to the dark side, I know, but I don't know if it's because I've been married for 11 years now or because I've got a kid, but I think it's making me soft. Not sure exactly what's happening, but that first scene somehow got me sucked in. And if you weren't here last week, we started a new series called Chick Flick. We're going to be reading in the book of Ruth. So if you have a Bible with you, you can find the book of Ruth. It's a really small book in the Old Testament, so it might be easiest to use your table of contents. Otherwise, it's the 8th book of the Bible, so you can start flipping from the left. You go past Genesis, Exodus, and a few other ones and find Ruth. But like I said, it's only a couple pages long, so if you hit 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, you've gone a little too far. So you can find the book of Ruth. If you don't have a Bible at all, we do have some Bibles back here in the middle. You can go ahead and grab one of those. I would love it for you to have a Bible. That'll be our gift for you today. If you weren't here last week, I'm going to try and recap quickly, but go ahead and sneak on into the theater. Keep your hands off my popcorn. And I'll give you a quick recap of what's happened in the movie so far while you find the book of Ruth. Last week we were introduced to an Israelite family. The head of the family, the husband, was named Elimelech. They lived in Bethlehem, which means house of bread, and yet we come to them in a time where there is no bread. They're in the middle of a famine. So the first little bit of irony in the story. So Elimelech, whose name means my God is king, decides that he knows what's best for his family, so he takes them and they move to a place called Moab to try to get by. He takes his wife Naomi and their 2 sons and they go to Moab. Moab, if you're familiar with Israelite history or the Old Testament, is not a great place. There's times of peace, but there are many, many times of war between Moab and Israel. The Moabites worship a god that they call Chemosh, which the main way that they honor this god is by child sacrifice. These are not good people overall. So this is not a great choice. Shortly after they get there, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi with just her 2 boys. They marry Moabite women, which is completely against some of the things that God talked about in His law. So they're completely headed off in the wrong direction. Shortly after they get married, the 2 sons die. So now there's just 3 women, 2 Moabite, 1 Israelite, unable to provide for themselves in the midst of a patriarchal system. They're at the bottom caste, if you will, and not sure what to do. Naomi finally recognizes at one point that it's time to go home, that she shouldn't be here, that things are going better. She hears word that things are going better back in Bethlehem. She decides to pack up and go. She takes off with her daughters and realizes somewhere along the journey that life isn't going to be good for you guys in Israel. Things are not going to go well. It's not going to be easy. You're better off going back home. Go back to your parents' house. Find a new life. Let me go alone. Orpah, one of the 2 daughters, begs to stay with her, but ultimately turns around and heads back. Ruth, the other one of the 2 daughters, the one for whom the book is named, it says that she clings to Naomi. She will not leave. There's something about this woman, Naomi. And so she goes along with her. She's willing to leave everything. She's willing to leave everything she's ever known, her friends, her family, her gods that she grew up worshiping, and go to a completely distant foreign land where she knows nobody and is often considered an enemy. She tells Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. She forsakes everything that she had before to go serve the Israelite God and stay with Naomi. So where we ended last week, Ruth and Naomi had just strolled into the village of Bethlehem. Barley harvest was just beginning. There were a lot of things happening. There's a lot of commotion. There's a lot of hope in the harvest, and yet we saw Naomi wasn't quite sure that she had anything to be hopeful for. And so as that scene closed, we cut away from the women to another building, another house, another structure where the movie is going to introduce us to a new character. So hopefully you've had a chance to find the book of Ruth, because I want you to be able to watch this movie with me. We're going to start in chapter 2, verse 1. There we go. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Stop right there. The audience all of a sudden gets a little bit of a clue as to what's going on. If you were here last week, you might recall that Naomi had told her daughters, when she told them that they should go back home, go back to their parents so they could remarry, that she had no other family. There was nobody left for them if they came with her. And yet the author gives us a little bit of a clue that maybe God is up to something. Naomi doesn't remember it yet, but there's this guy named Boaz. And he's a relative of her deceased husband. It calls Boaz here a man of standing. Other translations said a man of great wealth, or a prominent man of noble character. This same phrase is used in other parts of the Old Testament to say a man of valor. In other words, what I think this guy is trying to tell us, what I think the author is trying to tell us, while all of these things are certainly accurate, and we'll describe Boaz as we get through the story, I think this is the knight in shining armor, right? Every good love story has the knight in shining armor, and Boaz certainly lives up to the bill. And so after we're reminded of this guy, we just kind of see him there. He doesn't really tell us a lot about him other than this is a really great guy. And then the scene cuts back to Naomi and Ruth, where they're living. Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So all of a sudden we start to see this a little bit here. Ruth goes to Naomi and she asks, "Let me go out and work. Let's not beg. Let me go out and work for the both of us." She asked her permission. We have to understand what gleaning was. It says that she went to glean after the harvesters. To glean literally means to collect a little bit by little bit. Okay? That's what gleaning actually is. In ancient Israel, this was like their social assistance program. Okay? In Leviticus, in God's law, God told the Israelites, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. In another section in Deuteronomy, he said a similar thing. He said, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, don't go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. And when you beat the olives from your trees, don't go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. And when you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. God's trying to do something here. He's trying to put generosity into the hearts of the people. He's saying, look, there are people who cannot provide for themselves in this type of society. I want you to make it a habit of taking what you can get, but leaving the rest, so that they have something to live on. But not only did it teach generosity to the farmers, it also taught the poor that they didn't have to beg. They could keep some of their dignity. It taught them to be active and go work for their food. This was not an easy process. When Ruth heads out to get to work, she knows this is going to be tough. This is long and tiresome work. Sure, God commanded to leave the edges of the fields, and He told the farmers to cut corners so that they could go and pick. But let's be honest, that stuff went quickly. The majority of what this was, again, gleaning, collecting bit by bit, was walking behind the harvesters and catching whatever was dropped, which could mean just a couple grains at a time. So it's a lot of stooping, a lot of bending, picking up very, very small amounts of food, just so you could have something. But Ruth gets to work. And then I love where it said, As it turned out, she was working in a field that belonged to this relative. In other translations, it said, it just so happened. I love that the author tries to make this, oh, what do you know? Right? You can decide for yourself how she ended up in that particular field. However, as she's been working for a while, and meanwhile, the camera shifts to the opposite side of the field. And you can still see her off working in the background, but all of a sudden she's not the forefront character anymore. And we jump back in at verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer, the supervisor of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." Yeah, that's where I wanted to end. Sorry. So Boaz shows up on the scene, and he says, "Hey, Lord be with you." And they answer back. We get this first picture again. He's a man of a prominent man. He's a man of noble character. He has a wonderful relationship with his workers, and we see it right off the bat. This is a good dude. And he asks the supervisor about this woman, and the supervisor says, "Man, you will not believe the humble spirit this woman has. How hard she's been out here working. She actually came up and asked if she could glean in the field." I mean, think about this. Technically, gleaning was her right under Israelite law. If they'd have told her to leave, she could have quoted Leviticus or Deuteronomy back to him and said, I have a right to be here. It says the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. I'm all of those right now. She had every right, and yet she respected their authority. She understood something a little bit different. And somewhere, as this is being explained and the camera shows Boaz, you can see the look of admiration on his face. He recognizes there's something special going on here. And so maybe he walks over, maybe struts over, I don't know. Maybe like any good shining knight, maybe he rides over on a white stallion. Maybe he's got the supervisor following him with coconut shells. I don't know what exactly he does to get to the other side of the field, but he makes his way over to Ruth, and we pick up in verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And like most good chick flicks, the main characters meet in a special way, right? It's because of her attitude, because of her work ethic, that God blesses Ruth through Boaz. And he comes over like the knight in shining armor, and he makes sure she's taken care of. He provides a few things for her. He provides companionship with the women. He knows that she doesn't have friends. She doesn't know anybody. He says, "Walk along with my women." These would have been the women, the female workers that he had out in the fields following along behind the men. Probably the ones tying the bundles as the men picked them and harvested them. And so he provides companionship by allowing her to follow close behind his female employees. He also provides protection for Ruth. One of the things that we have to remember is that the men who were working out in the fields, probably not the highest character men in the area. And if you recall from last week, We talked about all of this is happening during the period of the Judges. The period of the Judges was most well defined by the last verse in the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. In a culture where women had very little value, especially a foreign woman, especially a Moabite woman, you can see how important this protection would have been for Ruth. And then the last thing that he provides is refreshment. Think about the working conditions. This is sun up to sundown, lots of stooping in a hot, hot environment. And he says, when you're thirsty, we got some water. You don't have to go find your own. You can have some of ours. He makes sure that she is well cared for. There's probably, in my estimation, there's nothing really romantic happening yet. There's no indication of her appearance that he's attracted to her. And let's be honest, she might have been very attractive. However, she's just come back from Moab with Naomi on a long, hot journey. She's incredibly poor, so she probably hasn't eaten well. She's malnourished. She's been working all day up to this point. She's probably looking pretty ragged. I don't think Boaz is doing any of this because he's interested. I think that he understands something different. I think that what Boaz is doing here, that his kindness is special. He's living differently than the other cultures. Usually it's if you do something for me or if this person has something that I want, I'm more than willing to go out of my way for you, right? He's showing kindness to somebody that has absolutely nothing to offer back. Jesus actually talked about this way of living a few centuries later. In the book of Matthew, it was recorded for us. Jesus said, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors, the lowest of the low, doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Look, it's easy to love the people that love you. It's much harder to show this kind of kindness to somebody that has nothing to offer. But Boaz, even centuries earlier, centuries before Jesus taught, he understood something not just about God's law, but he understood the spirit of God's law. Why did God tell us to live this way? And he understood something. He understood God's intention for Israel to live this way, to live differently than all the cultures around them, because he knew it would make others take notice. They'd look and say, well, I get why you're nice to that guy, but why would you do this for her? She has nothing. What do you get out of that? And Boaz understood it. And Ruth shows a humble and grateful heart once again. She doesn't respond and say, well, finally, somebody noticed how hard I've been working out here. She says, well, why would you take notice of me, a foreigner? There's no entitlement. She knows she's not from here. But Boaz recognizes her commitment to Naomi. He also recognizes her commitment to the God of Israel. Remember, she's left everything, and she has declared that the God of Israel will be her God, and she is doing everything she can to live according to the Jewish law. He recognized that. He knew how much she left behind, and so he encourages her in this new endeavor with his kindness. So after he says, may the Lord repay you, she responds in verse 13. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. I think maybe somewhere in the kindness, maybe somewhere in the soft-spoken words, all of a sudden maybe we get that little glimpse that hearts are being softened. As the camera zooms in on the two of them, I think maybe for the first time you see a little bit of a spark in each of their eyes. There's something about her smile underneath all the raggedness. There's something about the way he speaks and the kindness that says, this guy's different than the other guys. We get the idea that something is about to happen. The score might play some sweet music in the background. And then the scene cuts to later that afternoon, maybe early in the afternoon. Verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Did you see what just happened? Did you guys catch that? Come on, girls, I know you caught what just happened. They just had their first date. She's been working all day. Think about this. She's been working all day. They get to a mealtime. She's poor to begin with, right? She's poor to begin with. He invites her over to eat with the workers. Not to eat the raw grain that she's been harvesting, but to have some of their roasted grain, the good stuff. Oh, you can have some of this bread too, and you can even dip it in the vinegar. You know that she wanted nothing more than to just shove her face into that bread. You ever been that hungry? Where you're like, give me some dang food. You know she wanted to eat. But yet, what does it say? It says that she ate with him and she had some left over. She didn't even finish what was on her plate. That's a date. Girls, you know that trick. Come on now. So then she gets up and goes back to work. And Boaz grabs his supervisors. "Guys, hey, come here. This one here, she's special. I want you to take extra good care of her. If she wants to take from the things that we've already harvested, you don't say a word. But you know what? I know she won't do that. I've watched her. I've seen how she operates. So if she wants to, you let her, but she probably won't. So why don't you go ahead and just drop a little while you're walking? Make sure she has plenty to pick up." And she continues to work hard. And I know that we don't catch it in English because an ephah, like what the heck is that? It's about a bushel of barley. I looked up because I didn't know how much a bushel of barley weighs. It's like 48 pounds. Remember, she was picking up a little bit at a time, a few grains at a time. People gleaned so that they could just get something. This woman's walking out day one with 48 pounds of barley. He took some good care of her. Verse 18. So she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. So she comes back into town with this huge basket of grain, and Naomi is in shock because nobody's expecting this. She says, "Where in the world did you work that you collected that much grain?" Because it says that she brought back the grain and she probably brought some of the bread, her doggy bag that she brought home, right? Because no, you take it. I know I paid for it, but you take it. It's your food. And she gives that to Naomi. Naomi doesn't know what to think. And Ruth utters the name Boaz. "I worked for this guy named Boaz." And as the camera flips back, you can see Naomi thinking for a minute. There's something oddly familiar about that name. And then suddenly, it clicks. Verse 20. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finished harvesting all my grain.' Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.' So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." All of a sudden, Naomi's attitude completely flips. She all of a sudden is recognizing the hand of God at work. If you were here last week, remember when she came into Bethlehem, we said her name Naomi means pleasant. And she got back and the people said, is that Naomi? And she said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." Mara means bitter. She said, "I'm not pleasant. God is against me. You call me a bitter old woman." And all of a sudden, wait a minute. Maybe not all is lost here. And she encourages Ruth to stay near Boaz, not only because he's generous, but because she recognizes God is up to something. I forgot about that guy. We're actually related. He's our, it says, guardian redeemer. Some places say kinsman redeemer. This is a concept that we'll dig into in the next couple weeks and explain a little bit further. But she recognizes this guy's one of the leaders in our family, and I forgot about him. And so Ruth continues to work in Boaz's field until the harvest is over. So she works long days, hard days for many weeks, but she's well cared for. And my guess is she sees Boaz on more than one occasion. He just may happen to find a reason to stop by that particular field. And we'll see how this works out in next week's episode. However, what do we take away from this week's installment of our chick flick? I think there were a lot of possibilities, honestly, very similar to last week. I had a hard time figuring out how to cut it all down. We could have been here another hour talking about all the things in this next chapter, or in this current chapter, excuse me. But I want to just point out a couple of things fairly quickly. The first one that I think we can apply in our own lives is to remember that God has answers we don't know about. We want answers, but sometimes God doesn't show us the answer right away. In chapter 1, Naomi believed that God was fully against her, that she had no hope, that there was nothing to look forward to. It's better for you guys to go home. There's nothing for you here. My life is going to be nasty. You don't want to be a part of this. And then chapter 2 starts and the author says, "Oh, but remember Boaz? He's going to come back into play, Naomi. Don't forget about Boaz." And now she starts to see the beginnings of God's plan. She doesn't get the whole thing yet. She won't understand it. We'll see her continue to make mistakes, but she recognizes that maybe God isn't completely against her. Maybe He's actually working for her. I don't know what chapter 1 has looked like for you. I don't know what chapter you're in. But your last chapter may not have looked very good. It may be dark. Excuse me. But don't give up on chapter 2. If you'll remember from last week, though, chapter 2 requires action from us. One of our points from last week was that the best new chapters always start with faith and honesty. We have to be honest about where we are, and we have to act in faith. We have to move toward God in obedience. It doesn't mean that we have to be perfect, but I can guarantee that if you continue doing things your way, God's not going to bless that. God blesses His way. And that doesn't mean success. Success does not equal blessing. But you want to stay in God's good graces, obedience is the way to do that. Sometimes it's hard to know what that looks like. How do I know if I'm being obedient? How do I know if I'm moving where God wants me to move? I heard this principle as I was reading, and I love this thing. Maybe you've heard it before, applied to other situations. It's a whole lot easier to steer a moving car than a parked car. You ever heard that? I don't always know what it looks like, but maybe God's not using you because you're not moving. God wants to use you, but all He's doing, He's moving the wheel, and it's just turning the wheels back and forth. How do you know if you're moving towards obedience? How do you know if you're going in the right direction? Sometimes I don't know. But sometimes just moving and asking God to guide you allows you to get where you need to go. It's easier to steer a moving car. Ruth didn't just sit in the house and pray that God would make their situation better. She didn't just grab Naomi's hand and say, let's just pray that God will provide for us. That's important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that prayer isn't important. As a matter of fact, I think it's ridiculously important. But she also got out and did something about it. She took action just like Nehemiah that we saw in the kids' video. He didn't just stay and pray, man, that's messed up. What's happening over there? God, I hope you fix that. He went to the king and said, my hometown, the walls have come down. Will you let me go? And God made the way. Ruth headed out to the field. She got to work. She put her head down. And that's what allowed God to put her in the right field. And it just so happened that she worked for Boaz. But I think maybe the biggest takeaway from me, like I said, there are a lot of others. You can go home and read that story again yourself and see what God says to you. But maybe the biggest takeaway from me is that the way you work says far more about your relationship to God than the way you worship. We've defined faith before here as trusting God enough to do what He says. And if that's true, if that's what faith looks like, then how you work is going to reveal much more about who you are than where you spend your Sunday morning. It's easy to talk the talk here on Sunday. Half the time we put the words right up here on the screen for you. It's easy to blend in and look the part on a Sunday morning. But what about Monday? What about Thursday when it's been a long week? What about your interaction with that difficult client? Or with the boss that just seems to have it out for you? Or the kid that just won't listen? Right? Or the family member that's driving you crazy? Don't point, no elbows. If Sunday morning isn't changing Monday through Saturday for you, I'm not 100% sure why you're here. I'm not saying I don't want you to be here. We need to be here. We need to support each other. We need to learn to grow. But if it's making no difference, if we're living how we want anyway, then why bother? People will notice how we're living and working. The rest of the world will take notice. As Ruth showed us, whether you recognize it or not, people are watching. People are evaluating your actions. The supervisor was able to tell Boaz everything Ruth had done because he'd been watching, whether she saw it or not. And people will watch you, and it will either help or hurt your witness. You want to invite somebody to church, you want to tell people about Jesus, the way you work will either help you do that or it will hurt your chances of doing that. Overall, I think a lot of us are hurting our witness. I hate to say that. There was a particular study by Barna that I saw that showed that 85% of people thought that Christians, one of the top 3 traits of Christians was hypocritical. Love didn't even make the list. They think that we say one thing, but we live a different way. And I know that statistics can sometimes be manipulated. Polls aren't always, I get all that. But come on, you know that to be true. Culture at large believes that Christians just say a lot of things. We don't actually do what we're saying. I'm not saying you got to live perfect. I'm not saying that when you work, everything's going to go just right. You're always going to have the best attitude. You're never going to use a bad word. Whatever, you name it. You're always going to treat people the way they deserve to be treated. But hopefully we're making progress. Hopefully we're finding areas where what we do doesn't blend in with the culture around us. Where just like Jesus said, the way we live will make people take notice. We don't just love those who love us. We go out of the way to love our enemy, the stranger. Boaz recognized the faithfulness of Ruth in the field, not in a temple. Jesus modeled that kind of work ethic, that way of living for his disciples. And it was so ingrained in them, it was so important that when Peter finally tried to write a letter, probably dictated it because he probably couldn't write, but when he wrote one of his letters, he said, "Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind." And a little later in the letter, he says, "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." You ought to live so good that people say, "Look, I don't know about all the Jesus stuff, but that's the kind of dude I want working for me, because he ain't like everybody else. I don't know about the Jesus stuff, but that's the woman I want marrying my son, because she's different." Christianity spread in the first century because Christians lived differently. And everybody around them took notice. They cared for the sick at their own personal risk. Remember, there was no medicine. Most of the time, if there was a plague, people got pushed to the outskirts of town. And when a plague became to the point where you couldn't stop it, when things became viral, people just got up and left. The first ones to go, most of the pagan priests, because they knew what was happening before everybody else. Because everybody would come to them hoping that their family member or so-and-so could be healed or could be, whatever, delivered from their sickness. And after the third or fourth person brought to them, they looked around at their family and said, "Hey, we got to get out of here. Something bad's happening here." And the Christians stayed at great personal risk. Some of them died right along with the sick, taking care of them, trying to make them comfortable. They cared for widows and orphans, the people that didn't have anything, that couldn't provide for themselves. Christians took care of them. And they treated other people fairly, sometimes even treating them better than themselves, as we saw with Boaz and Ruth. Are you looking for chapter 2 in your life? You got to get honest about your faith. What does your work week look like? Are you different on Sunday morning than you are the rest of the week? Does anybody know that you're different if they observe you? Do you work in a way that would make Boaz take notice? Or do you just blend in with the culture around you? A change in chapter 2 is going to start with our attitude. We got to get our attitude in order, just like Ruth did. She was humble. She was unentitled. She was ready to serve. When we have our attitude right, it's much more likely that we're going to make good choices. And those good choices as we move through life are going to be what allows God to work in and through us. So that's my question for you this morning. That's what I want to leave you with. What attitude are you going to choose? Regardless of whether your circumstances change, regardless of what anybody says, maybe like Nehemiah, they'll make fun of you. Maybe like Ruth, they'll just wonder. Maybe nobody will say a word. But in the privacy of your own home, before you head into work tomorrow, Monday morning, what attitude are you going to choose? I would challenge you to think about Ruth and the way she worked that made people take notice. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you for your word, for the opportunity to gather here in your presence, to learn from you, to understand what you have to say to us. God, I don't know where everybody is coming from this morning. I don't know what circumstances everybody's been facing. God, I know you do. You tell us that you know our needs before we even ask. So God, for those of us who are struggling, and I would bet that's more than not, will you speak to us right now, please? Will you show us in our heart the steps that we need to take to be obedient? Reveal, as painful as it may be, those areas where we have not been obedient, so that we can turn around, so that we can move away from disobedience and move back toward you, so that we can recognize that you are not against us, you are for us, regardless of our circumstances. That even in the toughest circumstances, you have promised to walk with us. God, I pray not for better circumstances, but for better life. A life in you, a life with promise, a life with hope. God, if there's anybody in here who has never experienced that hope, I pray especially for them in this moment that you would speak to their heart. Let them know the hope that you offer. Let them know the life that you've called them to. Let them know who you created them to be. If that's you this morning, all it takes is simply saying, God, my way is not working. I'm tired of it. I want your way. I don't know how to do that, but one step at a time, will you make me into what you wanted me to be? And I promise you, he will. God, for the rest of us, we know that while we may have said that before, it is a daily choice. That it's so easy to fall back into our old patterns, into our old life. God, I pray that in this moment you would remind us that you still love us, that you forgive us, and draw us back to you through your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.